This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Joshua, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. The chapter starts off by telling us the reaction of the kings that were inhabiting the land that the nation of Israel was going to come in and occupy because God had promised it to them. We find that the Bible tells us that the hearts of the enemy melted away and that their courage faded away. Now you'd have to ask yourself this question. There were 7 nations that were occupying the land, and why is it that they who outnumbered the nation of Israel numerically would have this kind of reaction? It was because in that moment they realized that all that they had was not able to stand up against the God of the nation of Israel. I think they also realized in that moment that the God that they worshiped had failed them, and the God that the nation of Israel worshiped had delivered them. And as a result of it, their hearts melted and their courage faded away because they realized that everything that they possessed was not going to be sufficient to stop what God had purposed. And when we as God's children respond in the same manner as the nation of Israel, in that they followed their spiritual leader and that they followed God, then we should put in the hearts of our enemy a spirit of fear and a spirit that would melt away their hearts and also take away their courage. But it requires us to go before the Lord and requires us to follow the Lord wherever it is that He leads us in order that we might have the enemy be discouraged. The second thing that we notice is when you get to verse 2 through 9, Joshua is given a specific commandment by God, and that was that he was to make knives of flint and that he was to circumcise all those that were of the fighting age of the nation of Israel. For 40 years there had been individuals that fell by the wayside that had been circumcised. But the generation that had crossed the river Jordan had never been circumcised according to what the Word tells us. When you get to verse 4, you see that it answers the question of why is it that they had to be circumcised. This was a transitional moment in the nation of Israel's history. The old generation had died off, and the new generation was stepping up to take control. We find of the old generation that they had brought reproach upon the Lord, and that's why they had to die. It also says that they had been disobedient to the Lord, and that's why they had to die. It also tells us that the current generation is a generation that had never been circumcised. The one thing that we want to remember is that circumcision was not to affirm the relationship with God, but it was to identify the relationship with God. When you go to the book of Acts chapter 15, you find that circumcision was still a point of contention even in the New Testament age. There, Paul and Peter are dealing with the church, and a reaction of which some in the church had that were still trying to teach the old way, that circumcision was part of the process of being saved. But Peter in verse 11 of Acts chapter 15 emphatically said no, and he went on to say, we believe it is through grace of our Lord Jesus Christ that we are saved, just as they are. Peter and Paul realized that it was not anything that man could do to himself, it was what God had to do for man, and that was being saved through grace. Now, in the Old Testament, circumcision was a mark that was placed upon the Israelites to show them that they were identified with God, but the relationship had already been established with God. And one of the things that we want to focus on is not so much the act of circumcision as much as it is what circumcision was supposed to reflect, and that was that they had a relationship with God and they were identified as being with God. One of the things that we need to do, because when you look at the book of Acts chapter 15, they went on and said, and the church delivered a message back to those that were having this point of contention. In the last part, we find that it tells them that they wanted to focus on the message that those who were saved didn't need to worry about the act of circumcision, but they needed to worry about living a life that reflected that they were identified with Christ through the way in which they lived their life, and they gave them specific instruction. One of the things that we want to understand as God's children is that we need to bear the marks of being identified with Christ and that He has claimed us as His own, and we make that evident by the way that we live our life. When you go on, you take a look at the end of the chapter, there's something that's just kind of dropped in there, but it shows us that this was a time of transition away from the old generation, and the new generation was now taking the helm of leadership for the nation of Israel. This was the last time that they would have ever experienced what it was like to have God provide for them through manna. We find specifically that it tells us that they, having entered the promised land, that they were going to eat of the fruit and the produce of the land. One thing that's instrumental that we need to understand is the timing of which God had the nation of Israel cross the River Jordan at the flood stage, and it was the time of which the harvest was going to be taking place. And God allowed the nation of Israel to move into a land where the harvest was about to take place, so that they had all the provisions that they needed in order to take care of the basic needs of life. God is never going to lead us anywhere but what he doesn't have the provisions already established for us, if we will through faith follow his leadership, even if it's through the high waters of life. Some of the high points that I want to take out of these 12 verses is, number one, that the enemy should flee before us, and their hearts should melt away, and their courage should fade away, because we stand up and proclaim what God has done for us. The second thing is that we need to bear a mark in our life that shows that we have a personal relationship with God, and that we are identifying ourselves with God through the marks of our life and the way in which we live our life. And then the third point is this: God is going to provide for all our needs of life, not necessarily all our wants of life, but God is going to provide for all of our needs of life, so that if he leads us somewhere, he already has the provisions waiting for us to sustain our needs.